Hi, and thanks for the invitation to come and speak today. Aiden thanked me specifically for walking across campus. I said, well, you promised a free lunch, so I grabbed my couple pieces of pizza quickly while you can enjoy yours. I'm talking today about a project that was the focus of a small grant. Now, that's an official classification from the Kauffman Foundation, and it was indeed pretty small, not a lot of money. If you want a big grant, the bureaucratic procedures are much greater. It is basically a chance to look back on a topic that some of you will know about and most of you will not, called the entrepreneurial ecosystem. Now, if you've looked at today's New York Times, you will have seen an article about San Diego, and in fact, it's an example of an entrepreneurial ecosystem that's had some success for some reasons I'll hint on a little bit later on. So I did this as largely a literature review, and as I've gotten into the literature, a number of policy issues have jumped out at me, a number of kind of process-related things have popped out, and I'll give you some of my thoughts on my findings to date. For those of you that don't do anything related to entrepreneurship, know that it's a problem. The blue line on the graph was in a New York Times article by Eduardo Porter last week, noting from some Brookings research that companies starting up in the United States have been on a relatively steady decline, and we don't really know why, but the topic of entrepreneurial ecosystems means that that's a different phenomenon from one place to another, that local issues, local systems, local cultures, local policies make a difference. So just to do something a little bit geeky here and give you some bibliometric evidence, we used to talk about the entrepreneurial environment. I've been doing this work for a few decades, and that was the common phrase. Sometimes you see entrepreneurial culture, but environment was the most common phrase, and until about 2014, 2015, that was the dominant phrase in the literature for looking at local differences from place to place in new firms. But in the last few years, handful of years, the word ecosystem has kind of replaced environment, and that's probably a good thing, because an ecosystem has stuff going on. It's not simply a container or a place in which new firms are operating. Part of this literature review let me look at what I called the old pre-ecosystem literature and the new stuff, and the point of this is to particularly to highlight a few topics, a few things that seem to occur in areas that have new firms that did not appear back in the 60s and 70s in the, I'll have to say, early Silicon Valley days when most of this research was going on. You'll also see that there's not a lot in these lists, usually compiled by business school faculty, that have to do with public policy. And that's sort of a quirk of the literature, but most entrepreneurship scholars, in fact, are in business schools. So let me give you a couple of definitions. I'll throw a few more your way too, to say what exactly I'm talking about. Entrepreneurial ecosystems are the union of localized cultural outlooks, now there's a fuzzy phrase for you, social networks, investment capital, universities, and active economic policies that create environments supportive of new ventures. They could also be considered communities of agents, social structures, institutions, and cultural values that produce entrepreneurial activity. And I've compiled a much longer list of definitions, a few by Daniel Eisenberg, who is probably the consulting guru-in-chief at Babson College. He goes all over the world to try to help countries as well as communities create environmental ecosystems. So his view is, in fact, about as broad as you can get, and in fact, he has created a lot of policies for national governments. A little bit later on, there'll be some examples of diagrams from this. But this is more or less the view that Eisenberg proposed, and if you see anything about the entrepreneurial ecosystem, or let's put it this way, if you were to Google it up right now on your phone, this is pretty much what you would find as the result. It's a whole bunch of things, okay? He calls them elements, and it turned out that those 13 were too many, so he reduced it to 6. Nobody could keep track of 13, so he reduced it to 6, but he still has, if you'll notice, 13 different topics around the outside, but at least, you know, the brain can handle 6, not so many. So he actually went from 13 domains to 6, and 54 elements were collapsed to 51. He just couldn't collapse lower than 51 on that score. But let me go back a couple of decades, because Eisenberg is famous for having put forward his idea in a Harvard Business Review article in about 2010 and in a couple of other papers after that. But we can go back 20 years earlier to some work by Raymond Smiler, who, working within Austin, Texas, created his own diagrams of what is involved in entrepreneurship, and it's not really so different. And so I bothered to count these. There are 23 factors within 8 initial conditions within 4 key factors, okay, geometrically going out. Many other people have created other sorts of diagrams. I'm going to kind of give you a little pictorial tour of this literature before we get into the nuts and bolts. But this view by Rolf Sternberg in Germany makes it very clear that you've got a national set of policies and conditions as well as regional ones that are completely distinct. And so the point for geographers like myself is that it always matters where you are and that things work at different scales, the national scale being larger and broader than the local scale. But it was in 1995 that the word ecosystem first appeared in the context of entrepreneurship. The Silicon Valley entrepreneurial ecosystem was described in exactly those terms, made up of, as you'll see, 6 different elements, components, sets of actors, some of which are in fact human agents, others are just sort of there, like support infrastructure and entrepreneurial spirit. And this sort of circular view, you've already seen sort of the end times, according to Eisenberg, is to put all these things in a big circle and say, well, this is what we have cooking within our ecosystem. And they usually have to do with, to some degree, people and their knowledge and their talent, some amount of money to be able to put that talent into fruition, and technical skills to be able to do that. So you've got a variety of places around the world that in the last few years have created their own image of what this looks like. Here's an 8-component set that the folks in Sydney, Australia have done, a very kind of disorienting, asymmetric looking similar diagram by the folks in Adelaide. They don't want to follow what goes on in Sydney too closely. And we can start to take this apart a little bit, going back even a little further. One of the most influential pieces in the research by American researchers on entrepreneurial ecosystems is about Boulder, Colorado. And for those of you that haven't kept up with Boulder, it's a foodie heaven. All kinds of natural food companies have started there, in addition to telecommunications firms and so on. And they're mostly, and this is a process that will become more important later, it's kind of like the Silicon Valley process of spin-off, where one firm begets another, and this is, if they stay locally, the way that environmental ecosystem, entrepreneurial ecosystems become dominant. So you've got a variety of these sorts of things. This is one of the least circular of them, and it actually includes policy. This is by the Center for International Private Enterprise that surprisingly enough, admits that policy can be helpful. The World Economic Forum weighed into this a few years ago, creating what it called the pillars, 8 pillars here of an entrepreneurial ecosystem. What you're seeing is just kind of, a lot of people want to talk about it. Nobody seems to be able to agree on how to imagine it, how to show it. But at the local level, you've got places like Charlotte, North Carolina, that basically bought a big consulting study that put into play the array of things you'll see at the top: government and quasi-government. So it's kind of dealing with the various other actors in the governance system of Charlotte. And in fact, what you just saw was the simplified version of this thing, which even when you zoom in and blow the thing up is literally impossible to decipher. I mean, it's too much, but the consultants got their check, cashed their check, so it was all right. So a lot of diagrams, a lot of kind of lists divided into what they are typically called sets of elements. But having gone through that array of different examples in the literature, I've decided to kind of focus on and give you a definition of my own, rather than when you see where it came from and see the mess to some degree that this represents, to say that an entrepreneurial ecosystem is not a thing, it's a process formed of people and their networks, and not the static list of ingredients that we tend to see. This ecosystem will evolve and change over time, and it needs to be energized and reinforced, where it can become negative, weak, sparse, and unfavorable. And those are all words that sort of pop up in the literature. And you can actually think of an ecosystem as having an existential purpose, and that is to reproduce itself, to renew itself constantly, because if it is made up primarily of entrepreneurs, which it has to be, or would be some other kind of ecosystem, then the continuous formation of new firms is in fact essential. So I'm going to throw a lot of diagrams at you. It's easy to do. They can illustrate better than me making up one that is more generic. And I'd rather you see some of these that came out of some solid research, such as that by Marianne Feldman and her colleagues in the Washington, D.C. area. And what they've really done is to say, well, things start out locally because of policy, entrepreneurs, and some regional outcomes, and then this thing becomes bigger and bigger. It's basically a growing virtuous circle that turns into the endpoints here being a fully functioning entrepreneurial culture with incubators, supportive social capital, and so on. The folks in Finland just proved this isn't just an American obsession, have looked at how the Finnish high-growth entrepreneurial ecosystem generates startups. And the whole point is in Finland is that there are a whole lot of sources of money, some of which are local, some of which are from within the governmental policy system, and others are not, and some are even attracted from the outside. So the array of things that get called entrepreneurial ecosystem are in fact enormous. So in the last couple of years, 2 and 3 really at the most, a few people like Eric Stamm have tried to create something a little more organized. Let's not say all these things are equal and they're all around the circle in some more or less equivalent way, but let's say that some are framework conditions, and that's a word you know Europeans love to use, this word framework conditions, also involving physical infrastructure, similar to what Eisenberg said, but culture always being a part of it. And then there are some other things that are part of a system, where there's this constant process of change and evolution, and presumably a virtuous circle going on. And those create entrepreneurial activity, and those create value creation is a kind of a phrase that business school people like to use to not say profit, but it means profit that can then be reinvested or given away or something of the sort. So part of what it took a long time for anyone to really start thinking about is, well, if you can have an ecosystem that's like Silicon Valley, no one else can get to the Silicon Valley stage very easily. Let's go back to the beginnings. Where can we start and where can we go from there? So thinking about some of these as embryonic, in other words, just starting out, what needs to happen to have them go to, and I don't know that I like the phrase, but scale up. But it's a kind of a techie phrase to mean get big. And some locations are able to create the entrepreneurial orientation that allows them to grow. 2 phases from baby to adult seem to skip all of the adolescent years, which sometimes is a good thing with people, but maybe not so much for an ecosystem. So we have some work by a group of Brazilian people who have looked at tech in ecosystems starting out as nascent to evolving to mature to and they were the first to use this word, self-sustainable. In other words, to think about these as unlikely to fail. They get up to a point not where there's going to be a decline, but where, in fact, things are cooking nicely. The way we think Silicon Valley is now is sort of hard to imagine that that could go back to nothing. And in fact, that's probably, again, the ideal for most of this research. So a group of scholars, or consultants, I guess, working with World Bank money have begun to get into the act here. Okay, a lot of this work sort of gets out of academia and turns into the world of consultants. And a number of cities around the world, some quite hard to imagine, such as Beirut and Dar es Salaam, have been studied in just this framework, where they have, as the earlier work says, nascent entrepreneurial ecosystems. There are a couple of firms, and they haven't really amounted to much. Then they'll use as the intermediate term advancing, and then mature, which might or might not be self-sustainable. We're not quite sure. There have been only those 2 studies plus, believe it or not, New York City. Now, what New York City, Beirut, and Dar es Salaam exactly have to do with each other, and if they're good comparisons with each other, I don't know. But that's what we have so far from this group. Another kind of well-publicized set of research. This is the second one from the Global Genome, or Startup Genome Group in San Francisco, have created a global startup ecosystem report. They had done one in 2015, and of course Silicon Valley always comes out at the very top. It includes places such as Bangalore, Chicago, Austin. So it's sort of a large number. And they do this on the basis of what they're calling systematic research, trying to break down, and I'm not saying this is like the ecosystems that everyone else was putting in a circular form, but they include some of the things that are measurable. More on the measurableness in a little bit. And they've come up with a diagram. Rather than just giving these things labels across the top, they in fact draw it and make us see that this is a process, and there might be some flattening, but in fact startups continue to increase as time goes on. And so we have phases in the life cycle model of these startup ecosystems. So these guys, who are basically just tech entrepreneurs in San Francisco, have done social science by the seat of their pants, as we would say. And it's actually fairly good stuff for a very small number of ecosystems. And they've gotten a large amount of publicity without any academic input at all, and without any intention to help policy. They're just looking at what's out there. They do surveys of entrepreneurs, and they've created this. Very much seat of the pants research by non-academics. But what academics have done is something that is probably not very helpful. This was a couple people looking at the Phoenix area, thinking, oh, Phoenix has entrepreneurs, maybe something like this could be happening there, and they find instead, no, Phoenix is always fizzling out before we ever get anywhere. And so they've said, in essence, if they put this forward as a, we'll call it the model of an entrepreneurial ecosystem, that they grow, they sustain, and then they decline. Now, I don't know why they would anticipate decline other than they were sort of buried by the negativity of the Phoenix situation, as close as I can come to an answer. What other places, such as Adelaide and Australia, have done is to take advantage of something that many of the others haven't. If you've gotten the drift so far, they're mostly snapshots. Sort of like, well, this is what we know now, this is what happened at this point in time. Well, in Adelaide, they decided to, on 3 different years, do an inventory of what's working under these different categories, and these are sort of, what are there, 8 or 10, I forget now how many, I didn't count them, but there were 88 entries in the first year, and they get up to 129, so there's a growth in number of supporting programs, actors within the ecosystem. And it's now not put in that same format, but they still have a lot. So what we're trying to do, I'd say we entrepreneurship scholars are trying to understand now what really goes on over time. What can we say through these 4 phases? And Harrington is himself an entrepreneur in the St. Louis area, and he has his own labels for these things, but he's at least thought about what goes on in relation to entrepreneurs, what goes on in relation to the new ventures coming in, and what about economic development, which includes, in his terms, policy. So there's very little mention of policy in the, whatever it was, 30 slides I've shown you so far, but it's beginning to pop up a little bit. So thinking about this definition of an entrepreneurial ecosystem as a process, these are dynamic social constructions, to use a good social science label for them, co-evolving with a roster of entrepreneurs that's going to change over time, service providers that will change over time because different ones will come in and go, and as politicians get elected and leave office, there'll be new ones popping up, there'll be new sources of capital, and in fact new institutions. Most people who work on this, especially the entrepreneurs themselves, say the entrepreneurs have to be at the center. This isn't something that can be policy-led, because what do policymakers actually know about starting and running a business, they say. And in fact, they're probably right, and so entrepreneurs are at the center. But knowledge of what's going on, how things are connected, who influences whom and when, is really dispersed among a large number of people. And no one, it seems, from the biggest kind of longitudinal studies we have, seem to know about the whole system in its entirety. There's a category, and it's hard to know if these are amenable to policy or not, a group called social entrepreneurs or community entrepreneurs, people who kind of care as much or more about the community, about local development, than they do about their own business. And there's way too little research on this category. It stretches out over a very long period of time. It's getting some interest again because of that. One of the things that we've learned from, partly by comparing the good studies that seem to take a very broad view, is that we learn more from them if they're updating their information constantly, so you don't just have a snapshot now, a snapshot later, and say, oh, well, this happened. Well, you don't know if it happened because you haven't checked all the time in between. And sometimes we don't know even that an ecosystem has emerged for a very long time. Well, San Diego's on the screen. Let me just point out the San Diego case. The New York Times article today talks about San Diego now being threatened by Qualcomm, the company that does most of the chips and software in your phones, all of our phones, is about to be bought out, or it's being threatened with being bought out. And so the people in San Diego are very afraid that they will lose their key philanthropist, key technological advisor, that much of what San Diego as a technical place is because of Qualcomm. And so it's worth reading as kind of a after the fact forecasted. So looking at this in kind of a research agenda kind of way, we're starting to see some studies look at phases over time in a realistic way, rather than simply with snapshots. Some of the best long-term views have used phrases like flexible recycling, sort of a terrible phrase, but it began in Silicon Valley, and it's this incessant creation of new companies. You'll see a little paragraph or so on it in the Times article, and failures, and some of those people turning around starting up other firms. There are blockbuster entrepreneurs who become angels. You all know what angels are. They're the people who invest money in local businesses, new firms, basically for nothing. I first ran across these people when I was working at the University of Florida and did a study with a Dutch exchange student of small companies in the Gainesville area. And randomly, 10% of the firms we interviewed said, oh yeah, we got help from Dr. Cade. And some of you will know Dr. Cade was the guy who invented Gatorade, became rich because the university did not have an IP policy. He got half the money when Gatorade was sold out to its first corporate owner. The university only got half. It would now want more than that, right? So he had millions to be able to invest in little companies. They just did this. Never hit the press. No one knew about it. You go out and talk to a random entrepreneur and they say, oh yeah, Dr. Cade helped me. Not only with money, but also with advice, tips on what to do, what not to do. Those are angels. If you haven't run across this, not amenable to policy, right? How are you going to tell somebody they're going to be an angel or not be an angel? Are you going to be able to convince somebody to part with their money because they're investing in something that could well fail? Not very amenable to policy. Local philanthropy. Again, not necessarily amenable to policy, although I think of the Columbus Foundation as a really well plugged in institution that works with the public sector as well as the private and the private and nonprofit sectors to be able to make the Columbus. Do we have an ecosystem? Not clear yet. One of the things we have to have an ecosystem is this flexible recycling, constant emergence of new companies. And they're not going to be happening. When I say constant, it doesn't mean like every month you've got to have 2.5 of them where it's going to fail. There will be these moments when a company will go bankrupt, people lose their jobs, well, some of them will start new firms. Somebody gets bought out, another company comes in, things happen. There'll be these moments, and not very clear from Feldman's kind of square virtuous circle diagram a while ago, that was the same thing that happened in the Washington, D.C. area. So these spin-offs, and when people are saying, well, it's not really a spin-off if they left and lost their job, so the word spawn is the equivalent of what's going on at that time. Most of us don't study these things. Too hard to do. How can you keep track of all of the new companies and where they grew out of? Very hard to do. Most of us just throw up our hand and say, oh, that's somebody else's job, or that's for a good PhD student. Oh, she dropped out, she never finished the job, right? Literally, that's what we say about these things. Heike Meyer, who was in Portland for a time, did this entire inventory of companies through 2007 that grew in the Seattle area, and then was able to identify them into their galaxies in the tech universe of Puget Sound, some of which came out of Boeing, which would have been the early ones, and Microsoft and Amazon. And so these are all, and you see them identified here as well, they are part of the Seattle ecosystem that Amazon is now going to share with one of 20 cities that are trying to get HQ2. Not that we're going to exactly get this, but that's what they're sort of implicitly promising, as you know. Okay, so if I think about policy, what we want to do is not to have this, we'd like to have this, right? We would know, yeah, things could fail. We could say we have an ecosystem, but we don't. Or we could actually get one. What can policy do to get us to B and not A? Well, a couple suggestions. This comes from Ben Spiegel, who was a student of mine several years ago before he went to do his PhD work at the University of Toronto. And this is a highly influential view because he's divided things up differently than anyone else has bothered to do. He doesn't have to have 6 categories. He doesn't do it in a circle. He's done a triangle. I mean, that's really unusual. Material attributes. Some of these things are sort of there and they're longer term, including, it includes policies as a material attribute. Interesting way to think about what you do. Social attributes have to do with people and their networks, talent, and so on. And then cultural stuff, on which I've spent a little bit of time talking today. So I don't know that this policy being a material attribute is the best way to do it, but it's a way that this is out there in the business school literature. I like this diagram the best. This is the Kauffman Foundation's way of talking about how to reproduce entrepreneurial ecosystems from place to place. I've counted things. They have 11 ingredients and 9 guidelines saying, well, it is, and think what a recipe is, it's a process, right? You've got to go through certain steps in the right order or your cake won't rise, to put it simply. And so there's a number of things here that are, in fact, not very amenable to policy, but they're all about the local culture and the way that people interact and deal with each other and value each other. And then we get down to a number of things that are related to policy, that are not going to work immediately, right? Education. More educated people are more likely to start firms than non-educated people, but not tomorrow and not necessarily next year. So some of these things are not well specified. The folks in Virginia tried to show us how this might work, and you can't read much of this. I guess I could try to blow it up, but what's most interesting down here is we have a group of levers, a system of levers that are things like networks. If I sit back there, I can see better than you can. Capital. Interesting way to think about it. There are flows that are needed to get things working so that people can create the startup system. It's more cute than it is actual, but it's a better way to think about it, I think, than pyramids and circles. I guess I used to play these sorts of games when I was a kid, so I still think it's a nice idea. One of the better pieces lately, and this just came out in at the end of 2017, is to literally think about these local ecosystems in terms of their actors. In other words, kind of leave aside infrastructure and material things, and let's look at who, in this process of social connections, is going to help make an entrepreneurial ecosystem happen in a place. Many of these will be entrepreneurs. Some will be people in other organizations who can help them. There's going to be some connections needed, and to some degree this is infrastructural, to some degree it's related to policy, and the entrepreneurial orientation sort of, whether entrepreneurs are kept at a distance or brought within the circles of the local governance network. So actors, and so Daniel Eisenberg has picked up on this recently as well, looking at who the actors might be. Notice that policymakers and public leaders are just one of 6. He likes these 6 circles. I don't know that he actually needed to have all 6, but they're there. And the groups are basically simply named as government is a bunch of people in their official elected or appointed roles, which doesn't really say anything about what the policies should be that they're going to be advocating. So there are some policy challenges in this whole thing. One is, if you go from nothing, a nascent system, you might have 1 or 2 new firms, what's going to create a thriving and bustling ecosystem? Well, it takes leadership, according to a number of the authors. There needs to be a tolerance of risk so that people are not going to think, oh, we're a failure, or we have individual firms failing, this place can't be an ecosystem. But most of all, probably, is the importance of this idea of mentoring and a culture of, well, let's help each other. And it doesn't mean just entrepreneurs helping newer entrepreneurs. It's other people who have known those entrepreneurs, sort of bringing history into the current policy advice. To do this in any place, you've got to have some background. And the background will always be longitudinal data, as I've already kind of mentioned. Probably some of the best work on this is the work that Marianne Feldman and Nicola Lowe have been doing in the Research Triangle area, where they've literally figured out where 4,200 companies have come from. It wasn't so many years ago when most people would have said Research Triangle is not an entrepreneurial area. They've got big companies, but it's not Silicon Valley. Well, it kind of is Silicon Valley once you look at the whole history and start tracking. They've also recently looked at the history of institutions in the area, different local, regional, state organizations that have had a role in entrepreneurship in the Research Triangle area. Another area, another place that has a thriving ecosystem. All right, people who recycle their money and knowledge back into the system. One place that comes up in many, many studies is Waterloo, Ontario. And most of you will know at least, and you'll probably snicker as you remember, a company that grew up in Waterloo, and that is Research in Motion, or RIM, the makers of BlackBerry. And of course, nobody uses a BlackBerry phone anymore. We just sort of, you know, that's all so pre-iPhone that we don't think about it. But the guys who invented BlackBerry are still recycling their money, providing support, pulling together new entrepreneurs, and keeping Waterloo one of the most thriving, not very big, places in the entrepreneurial ecosystem world. So knowing that there are these people, and they tend to be known. They don't usually want to be on the quiet like Robert Cade in Gainesville. Most of them don't mind being identified. Yeah, I made money. This is what I'm doing with it. I'm not spending it on a yacht. I'm helping other businesses. They get a little more social benefit from that. So one of the things that works as an idea, and I think this is a fairly good idea, Victor Huang is the author of a book called The Rainforest, and he talks about these ecosystems as based on flows of nutrients, ideas, advice, and knowledge, not money, notice. He's more concerned about these hard to measure aspects. And most people, like Philip Roundy, have said, well, we really ought to just ignore the things we can count because they're not as important in the long run. There is an example of something, you look up environmental or entrepreneurial ecosystem in Columbus, and you get a little list. It's a very little list, and it's not very helpful. So, again, I'm going to close here with a research agenda. what are the advantages? What do we know? I mean, I've been looking at this stuff now in pretty much full time for a couple of years, and I've shared with you 90% of what I know. A lot of it's diagrams, a lot of it's, well, this one has 13 of this and the other one has 8 of that. It's very difficult to make good sense of it. I know that some things are not very policy amenable, other things are. And what we haven't had is good public policy research to try to separate out the two sets of places, the ones that work and the ones that don't. We know that serial entrepreneurs, these blockbuster entrepreneurs are important, but if it's something that's going to keep continuing, is it because some people are continuing to spend their money? So I end here. A lot of this is in an open access paper that was just published online a few weeks ago. There'll be another paper to come on dynamics when I get it finished. Thank you.
So you mentioned the obvious ones like Silicon Valley and Puget Sound, but then when you're talking about Waterloo, you talked about how small it is. Is there sort of a generalizable impact of size of the labor market on the ecosystem?
Nobody knows. Nobody has tried to do a full inventory. They startup ecosystem people are keeping the numbers to 20, which is never going to get down to a very small place. We have no idea. But when the people, most of the stuff is in fact very anecdotal, and when we start looking at where might be the smallest places that are viable, self-sustainable ecosystems, Waterloo is probably among them. It'd have to be, I'll say, a college town, and a biggish college town like Waterloo. Maybe it's near enough to Toronto that it gets some benefit. It would be hard to say. But Austin gets included, which means Columbus's size certainly is adequate. Much smaller than that, not so clear cut.
I'm curious whether economic historians have looked at this issue. Over time, there are different industries that have declined, flourished, so there are different cities that have declined, flourished. So looking at it historically, then how things have evolved. Because, there are probably very few self-sustaining ecosystems. And, it's a big question whether they're going to be self-sustaining in 200, 300 years, right?
Yeah, there are not many good local economic histories of places due to their entrepreneurship. One of the few was Akron, Tire City, USA, and Detroit, both of which, Detroit basically says you go up and you go down, as the Phoenix graph tended to show. Akron is continuing to try to recreate itself as the polymer capital of the world, not so successfully. I think most people would agree. So the example, they have to be long enough term for an economic historian to be interested, right? They're not going to be happy with a quarter of a century. They want at least a half a century.
New York City would be a good example. London would be a very good one, for instance.
Those have been looked at, but not so much entrepreneurially. New York City is getting a lot of attention from a lot of the metric-oriented people who find things to count, and they'll count how many meetups there are each week, and so they've got spreadsheets filled with numbers, but is there a culture of entrepreneurship? Well, if you can pay the rent, maybe. There are constraints as well as facilitating factors in a place like New York. So in general, no, there's a few anecdotes, a few stories that don't quite mesh, and they've not been put in. Remember how new this concept is of the entrepreneurial ecosystem. It's so new that it hasn't kind of rolled into that realm of research. Yeah,
Thanks, Ed. This is really interesting. I think it was the Brazilian slide mentioned the media, and then one of your slides talked about the role of journalism, but I hadn't thought about that before. It wasn't that much on very many of the other slides. I was wondering what your thoughts were. And think about Columbus and the fashion industry, which got a pretty good industry here, but we don't have the media like there are in Detroit or in LA or.
Right. It's an interesting, as people start to look at what really is makes the difference between one place and another, or this group of places that have succeeded and the group of places that haven't, a couple of people, usually they're kind of local boosters, local social entrepreneurs rather than academics, have thought, we got good press, and the other place didn't. That's not a trivial observation, right? I mean, because press makes a lot of difference in terms of reputation, in terms of attracting capital, attracting talent, and so on. I mean, that's why you're asking the question, because you know these things. But the local media, or even attracting in national, international media, would be a way to kind of boost a reputation. Yeah, yours.
Research is generally about providing a good description, then an explanation, and most desirable is a prediction. Right? When I look at your colorful slides, I realize that the difference between the entrepreneur research and the research into what makes good leadership is about the same state of development, which is we know nothing. It's all over the map, right?
Right.
This seems to be a search for, and this is not a criticism of your presentation, I think actually your presentation bears out that this is a big problem. We're looking for the holy grail of entrepreneurship, and we haven't found it. Whatever angle we take, we're looking for a perpetuum mobile, which sustainable development in a way is, right?
Right.
So there are a lot of statistics. Angus Madison is known for his historic economic indicators going back to 2,000 years, right? But they don't pinpoint, and they don't have the kind of data that is localized for, say, London, for New York, or for Tokyo, or Melbourne, right?
Yeah.
So there is a big mismatch on the one hand between entrepreneurship literature that focuses on the local level and the kind of data that we do have at a very abstract level where there is a lot of data extrapolated as well. But
Yeah.
so I hope you're getting it published, and then we'll end with a small remark, something along the lines of the Holy Grail, when we're going to find it.
Yeah. Well, I mean, this is why the Silicon Valley startup genome people are at least systematically looking at 20 different cities. The World Bank Group would like to get enough money to fund, many more cities, basically not just at the New York level, but Beirut and Dar es Salaam to be the three, because they fall into three different places. And if there's enough research done to do the measurable, to do research on the measurable, we still need research on these unmeasurable, qualitative, fuzzy, touchy-feely sorts of variables that are going to be part of some of the local stories that are the things the journalists like, but even the journalists sort of don't stick to any long-term view.
I came to the Holy Grail idea when I saw your graph where it's going like this, because that says, wait a minute, there is progress, but we have a little slowdown there. Because the first one of Phoenix reminded me of Larry Greiner's piece in the Harvard Business Review. That was 1971.
Yeah.
Shows the same bloody curve.
Pittsburgh is an interesting example, I think.
Pardon?
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, because it has gone through decline and then it's coming back, or has already come back maybe. I don't know.
Yeah, it depends on who you talk to. But not because of entrepreneurs. I mean, there is some great success in terms of local economic development from a pretty low point. Shoshana.
Sorry, thanks. This is really interesting. So I've done some research and writing and publishing on arts entrepreneurship, which is a little big cousin in this field.
Yeah.
Have you seen any, in your research, have you seen literature on that, or any aspect of that growing field that has touched upon the work that you're doing?
The arts and arts entrepreneurs have not entered the entrepreneurial ecosystem literature. I know the two. Most people who study one won't know about the other. Now you know about both things. So, but you wouldn't have before. The two groups don't talk to each other, mostly because the journals we write in, the amount of publicity we get for the work that we do. I guess, yeah.
It really looks like government policy is to stomp out the entrepreneur between the environmental regulations and the OSHA regulations and the tax regulations at every level. It's just very difficult to get into a business, and you'd be better off financially flipping sides, and instead of trying to meet environmental standards, go be an environmental engineer or go be a tax lawyer.
And maybe that's why there's a decline.
absolutely.
More people are becoming engineers, perhaps.
I can tell you, I retired from Action Chemical, and this was about 20 years ago. And in a 5-year period, we bought 106 chemical companies across the country, and that was because they couldn't afford to meet environmental regulations. My sister owns a beauty salon in Worthington, which employs 18 people, and she's always complaining about the massive regulations. It's like government's just trying to kill people. And if you listen to the business channels now, the CEOs are talking about, they're optimistic more because Trump's trying to get rid of regulations than the tax thing.
Yeah, well, they might be part of what you could call the culture, entrepreneurial culture at the national level, but there's still massive differences from place to place. And some places will say, the hell with the regulations, I'll operate anyway, and they'll succeed. And other places will just feel, well, I can't be bothered. So
Okay.
the difference between those two choices is what we need to understand more. Yeah, Caroline.
Yeah, in response to Sean, one of the studies by Richard Florida on the growth of high-tech regions and cities showed that the co-occurrence of art and art centers was very highly correlated to the location of the technology businesses, so you might want to look at that. So also I wondered, and because you mentioned this is all new, and I think this might be a new term on an old set of studies. When I was first out of school, I did a work on science parks, science and technology parks, and regional economic development interest in bringing high technology into the into regions, and a lot of states had put money into science parks. A lot of countries had too, in an effort to try to recreate the conditions around, a Silicon Valley style or a Research Triangle Park kind of concept. So I do think there might be more, in terms of, to some extent, it's a new term for an existing set of literature that might be worth tapping into.
Well, but the ecosystem is bigger than a science park. And there's been a lot of research on science parks, and I've read, I'll say, too much of it. And it basically concludes that you can put these companies together on the same piece of real estate, and it doesn't mean they're ever going to talk to each other. And so what is important from the ecosystem literature is, number one, that they're talking to each other. It doesn't matter where they are, but they'll be able to do so if they're in some kind of proximity. And they probably have to have events to get them in the same place. And lo and behold, they'll actually make the effort to show up, even if they are in the same science park and they don't talk to each other the rest of the week. So, the science park literature is a little niche of this whole, where do we get startups from topic, but it's not been the big holy grail that we've been looking for a long time.
I'm looking at education policy, and I saw on some of your charts that education is one of those levers that move forward. The state of Ohio has been pretty intentional about building up career pathways, and particularly entrepreneurship pathways that start in high school. You have some CTE, 2-year and 4-year degrees to really help develop entrepreneurship. But a lot of where that's happening is in rural and small towns, and so I guess part of me as I'm listening to this, I'm sort of rolling through what I know about implementation in the state, and I'm guessing based on your research, would you say that those kids who are learning a lot and really are captured by entrepreneurship are more likely to be attracted to one of these other ecosystems, or what are your thoughts about the possibility of developing that type of a place in a small town, in a place like that's not, maybe in Appalachian, Ohio, or rural Northwest Ohio, or places where you might have a 2-year college, but you don't have an Ohio State, you don't have like Cleveland or someplace like that.
Yeah, well, it depends on what you mean by education. The formal education is giving people, enough what we used to call book learning and applications, but people need role models. And that's what are in very short supply in small towns and depressed rural areas, right? Not enough models, and not just like, well, you could be like her or you could be like him, but the people who have already succeeded helping the others. And it's this angel mentality and mentoring that are so important, and more important, I'd say, than having an educational program that isn't connected to the life of an entrepreneur. I mean, people like me talking to somebody in a small town isn't going to help, because I'm not one of them. And it'd be the same for almost all of you too, I'm guessing. It's great to have those local models. Where does the first one come from, or the first two? That's still kind of the mystery. It'd be nice to have a policy that would work as nicely as this one would like to.
Yep.
On that note, thank you, Dr. Malecki, for coming up today.